All right. Well, let's get started, everyone. I'm pleased to welcome you to this really important event. I'm Mark Lewis, as I hope many of you know. I'm the Executive Director of the Emerging Technologies Institute at the National Defense Industrial Association. And first, I want to welcome you to what is the first of a two-part series that's looking at how the defense industry can work with the historically Black colleges and universities, the HBCUs, and other minority-serving institutions. And our part of NDIA, the Emerging Technologies Institute, is really pleased to be co-hosting this event with NDIA's Science and Engineering Technology Division. So thank you to the division for joining with us. Before we get started, I just want to level set with some administrative remarks. First, attendees, let me ask that you mute your microphone, turn off your camera for the event, so that for the entirety of the event, so we can hear and see our speakers clearly, and we don't run into bandwidth issues. If you do have a question during the meeting, please submit your question via the Slido app. We'll share the access code and instructions on screen during the question and answer period, and we will try to get to all the question and answer questions that we can. So on the topic of HBCUs, today's meeting converges on this topic, and I would argue it's more relevant than ever before. Training and developing the STEM workforce of the future in order to meet our critical need for intellectual capital. HBCUs provide a source of U.S. citizen talent in STEM fields, which both the DoD and the defense industry need to perform controlled and classified research and engineering activities. The lack of clearable talent is a growing concern for both defense agencies and industry. But beyond that, the HBCUs, I think, are an untapped source of talent across the board. And so the department's efforts to expand its interactions with HBCUs and with the support of industry, I think, absolutely critical. Bottom line, the need for STEM talent from all of our colleges and universities is a Department of Defense priority, as it well should be. Let me start off with some thank yous. First, we're grateful to the National Academies of Science, Engineering, and Medicine for their work in shining a light on this issue. They wrote a report on defense research capacity at historically Black colleges and universities and other minority institutions, transitioning from good intentions to measurable outcomes. And we're going to hear a brief on this study today. That's going to be one of our main activities. And we'll follow that with a panel that will be discussing the topic of how defense industry can work with the HBCUs and the minority serving institutions. If I can, a few words of note about National Defense Industrial Association. We're a consortium of over 1,800 member companies, about 65,000 individual members, been in existence for over 100 years, now about 103 years. And the mission is to provide strategic direction to military technology challenges posed starting with World War I. Today, well beyond World War I, we're faced with similar challenges. Our old adversaries have resurfaced in some cases. We face challenges in how to protect and, frankly, defend our democracy. And a crucial element to our strategy is our scientists and engineers, our entire S&T enterprise, the folks who dream, develop, and deliver the technology that maintains our economic and national security. My very good friend, Dr. Victoria Coleman, who's the chief scientist of the United States Air Force, is going to be joining us today. And she's going to tell you about her recent work in standing up first ever University Affiliated Research Center, UR, with HBCUs, with the very, very noble goal of transitioning these universities into the top research powerhouses that we know they can be. So Victoria, let me first thank you for joining us at this event. And hopefully Victoria's on the line. Oh, and Victoria's not on the line yet. All right, she'll be joining us in a little bit. So let's go to the National Academies report. So a little bit ahead of schedule, but we're going to be hearing about the defense research capacity at historically Black colleges and universities and other minority institutions. I'm going to introduce Dr. Eugene Deloach, who will be briefing us on this really intriguing study. Prior to beginning his service as professor and inaugural dean of the Clarence Mitchell Jr. School of Engineering at Morgan State University, 1984 to 2016, Dr. Deloach completed 24 years of affiliation with Howard University in Washington, D.C. During his last 9 years at Howard, he led a department that granted bachelor's degrees to more African-American engineers than any school in the country. He has a bachelor's degree in mathematics and electrical engineering from Tougaloo College and Lafayette College, respectively. He holds a master's and a PhD in bioengineering from the New York Polytechnic University. In recognition of his many years of effective service to engineering education, Dr. Loach has been awarded honorary doctorates by Lafayette College in 1984, Binghamton University, and Tougaloo College in 2017. Dr. Loach became the first African-American to serve as president of the American Society of Engineering Education, ASCE, the world's most prestigious engineering education organization, during ASCE's 2002-2003 activity year. He is a life member, fellow of the society, which was founded in 1893. And he says that of his most cherished recognitions, Dr. Loach lists the 2017 Black Engineer of the Year Award, the 2016 Tau Beta Pi Distinguished Alumnus Award, the 2015 Omni Lifetime Achievement Award, and the 2014 ABET Claire L. Felbinger Award for Diversity. In 2017, he became a National Black College Alumni Hall of Fame inductee. And in 2019, he was selected as one of the inaugural recipients of the NSPE BMAC Legacy Achievement Award at the Reginald F. Lewis Museum. On the 14th of August, 2019, Dr. Loach hosted the Masters in Engineering and Cyber Engineering Cohort 3 completion ceremony at Morgan State University. So Dr. Eugene DeLoach, thank you so much for joining us. And we're very eager to hear what you have to say about this very well-researched, well-assembled report. And I will turn the floor over to you.
Thanks, Mark. I really appreciate that. And I want to say good morning to all the others who are online. I apologize for some reason. I'm having a little problem with my camera here. So I will, but I'll be working from the slides. And so we're on our way. I serve as chair, as you said, of this Academy study. And I thank you all for joining us today to overview the consensus study report from the Committee on Defense Research at Historically Black Colleges and Universities and other minority institutions. On the second slide, before we begin, I would like to take a moment to thank Mrs. Evelyn Kent, her colleagues in the Office of the Secretary of Defense, the Basic Research Office, and the Department of Defense as a whole for their invested interest and support of this study of the committee's work. I would also like to acknowledge on the next slide the hard work and dedication of the study committee that I had the good fortune of leading. These folk put their shoulder to the wheel and spent around 22 months or so together and coming up with this report. As you can see, we had a very diverse group of folks. The next slide, joining me today to present and discuss the report conclusions and recommendations are Dr. Richard Merry from the California Institute of Technology and Dr. Farouk Alvi from Florida A&M Florida State University in Tallahassee. We'll begin to present we will begin our presentation by providing a quick overview of the study statement of the task and provide a brief description of the committee's research framework and conclusions. And we'll end the report with the recommendations. Then we'll open up the floor for discussions and questions and answers. I think we're going to the next slide where you will be able to see the charge. Using the language of the FY 2020 NDIA legislation as a framework, the National Academy's statement of task focused on the overarching charge to examine the status of the Department of Defense research at historically Black colleges and universities and other minority institutions, and the methods and means necessary to advance research capacity at these institutions to comprehensively address the national security and defense needs of the United States. More specifically, the charge asked the committee to examine the degree to which covered institutions are successful in competing for and examining and executing Department of Defense research contracts and grants for defense research. Best practices for advancing the capacity of covered institutions to compete for and conduct research programs related to national security and defense. Recommendations for strengthening and enhancing the programs executed under Section 2362 of Title 10 United States Code. Fourth, the effectiveness of the department in attracting and retaining students specializing in science, technology, engineering, and mathematics fields from these covered institutions for the Department of Defense and their needs in the emerging capabilities and technologies. And a list of identifying each in the study. We also listed each of the institutions examined as a part of the study. The next slide. Before we get to the research conclusions and recommendations, it's important to first note that the NDIA language that called for the study specified a focus on minority institutions, which the NDIA defines as HBCUs and other institutions of higher education with at least 50% undergraduate minority enrollment. Within the final report, the committee flags the point that minority institutions, MIs, as we have shown, are defined very differently than minority serving institutions, MSI. Minority serving institutions that are either historically defined or enrollment defined and have varying threshold requirements of minority enrollment and institutional expenditures. For example, although Hispanic serving institutions are designated as MSIs, certain Hispanic serving institutions may not reach the student enrollment threshold criteria to be categorized as a minority institution. Therefore, it is important to note that the final report and implying policies, minority institutions are a subset within a larger group of minority serving institutions. And research on minority serving institutions cannot necessarily be applied when focusing on minority institutions. In a review of our charge, the committee had primary focus on appropriated funds for research, development, test, and evaluation. Within the department's overall research portfolio, the committee focused on a subset of funding allotted to support a combination of basic research, applied research, and advanced technology. Those are 6.1, 6.2, and 6.3. Because these are the two areas, because the 6.1 and 6.2 are the two areas, especially basic research, that represent the bulk of research funding available to the United States. Next slide, please. To carry out the charge, between October 2020 and March 2022, the committee held 12 virtual meetings. In addition, these closed session meetings, we also convened the public information gathering sessions to collect additional testimony and data to inform the committee's charge. Testimonies are collected from representatives, with separate military department, defense agencies, and programmatic offices within the Office of the Secretary of Defense, as well as leaders from a range of higher educational institutions. These meetings provided an opportunity for our members to learn more about the current landscape across DoD and the best practices and challenges in competing for DoD research funding. Last August, we released an interim report to share preliminary research findings, and now the final report has been released. In our next slide, in addition to the 4 public workshops, the committee has commissioned a number of data collection efforts to support their work, to address the statement of tasks, to seek out the best practices for advancing capacity at covered institutions, and to compete for and conduct DoD research programs. They also spoke with senior administrators and faculty from 13 HBCUs and MI across the DoD funding spectrum. The focus groups, and we had a number of focus groups, and these interviews were completed and then the major findings from the works were incorporated in the final study. As you will see in the later in this presentation, DoD related data is often difficult to collect. I think that we're ready at this point to move on and to have some of the findings and conclusions. And I will now hand this virtual podium over to Dr. Richard Merritt. Dr. Merritt.
Great, thanks, Gene. And if we could have the next slide, please. So I'll talk about research frameworks and conclusions. So basically the findings of the study, and say a little bit about the first recommendation, and then hand it over to Farouk to talk about the remaining recommendations. One of the things that we did is to think about what's the sort of architecture that we want to think about as we think about HBCUs and MIs and the way that they fit into the DoD research agenda. Next slide, please. And so part of this was to really think through, what does it take to be an effective performer of research for DoD? We broke it into 3 primary areas. One, of course, is that you need to have a strong institutional research and contract base. So you have to be doing research and have the sort of ecosystem around you that allows you to do that. And so just having research allows you to do more research. And so that's obviously one thing, and more money there will help build that capacity. Another thing you have to have, though, over on the right are the auxiliary services that go along with that. So you really have to think through how do you make sure that you have the legal team that you need in order to sign the contracts that are there? How do you make sure that you have the public relations office, the government relations office, the various types of things for filing IP and other HR systems? And so while this might seem obvious, obviously you're going to do that, you have to have those things. If you are an HBCU or MI that doesn't have that, because you're primarily a teaching university, and so you're not used to bringing in contracts and doing other things, but you have a master's program and you'd like to grow that, well, that has to be built up somehow. And there's a little bit of a chicken and an egg, because you can't write the proposals that are going to go out and create the level of indirect costs that are going to go fund all of that if you don't have the team to do that in the first place. And so one of the things that we think is really important for DoD to think about, and where industry, I think, can really help, is how do we help build up at HBCUs and MIs that capacity through the auxiliary services? Because it's, again, something that needs an investment in order to build that capacity so that the DoD can make use of that capacity. On the left-hand side of this triangle then is another piece, which is the research faculty support. Again, faculty have to have the time to do research. They have to have the ability to recruit graduate students and do other things. And they have to really know how to do that. They have to have the connections within DoD to understand, what's coming and how do I provide my input into that. And a big piece of that is really, again, providing the connections and time to do that. If you're at a teaching university or a university with a high teaching load, you don't have the time to do all of the research that's required. I'm fortunate to come from Caltech, and we have a quite low teaching load, which leaves us a lot of time to do research. So I educate through mentoring and through having graduate students, not just through teaching and lectures. But my colleagues down at Cal State LA have a much higher teaching load, and how they find time to do any research at all, always amazes me. And so again, we have to think about that. Are universities allowing their faculty time off if they're research active, for example? And not everybody does. And so again, we have to think about that. So we think that these 3 elements are really required. And we think that DoD and industry need to look at HBCUs and MIs that want to become more research active, that want to increase their capacity, and look at these 3 aspects and say, okay, great. Do you have all of these? If not, how can we help you get there? And so that's one piece. Another part of the framework we put together, next slide, please, is to understand that there's a different spectrum of universities. Not every university, HBCU, MI, or any other type of university wants to necessarily be a highly research active university. And so we tried to categorize a little bit 4 different categories of university. Here, undergraduate centric, research engaged, research active, and highly research active. And some of the properties of those universities that we thought were important in terms of thinking about, well, which group do I sort of fit in now? And if I want to go up to the next level, what are the things that might need to change? And so we put that together so that we could sort of think about, again, here's the capacity within our HBCUs and MIs. And we want to move, let's say, from a research engaged university to a research active university. Where are the investments going to need to happen? Where is the transfer of knowledge that allows that university to make that step going to happen? And how is DoD and industry, the defense industry in particular, supporting that? Maybe I'll use this spot to also say, one of the things I think that probably everybody on the call recognizes is that HBCUs, I think in the opinion of the committee, HBCUs and MIs are really an underutilized resource. They have capacity that's there, and a lot of the data that we collected support this, that would allow us to take better advantage as a country of the students going through. As one might imagine, the number of US citizens within HBCUs and MIs is typically higher than the percentage of US citizens at generally other universities. I'll point out in particular, MIs, one of the things that Jean pointed out is that MIs are 50% underrepresented. So this is really different than MSIs, which is only 25% underrepresented students. And so you have a really large pool of US citizens. And so taking advantage of that by allowing HBCUs and MIs to do more research, train and educate a workforce that can come into and support the national security mission and the defense mission of the United States is really something that we haven't utilized as much as we can. And so I think a lot of the report is trying to say, here's where some of those gaps are, here's where we can do things. And I think importantly, it's not due to a lack of desire. So I think it was clear to us as we were looking through the data that DoD wants to allow institutions to move up through this sort of set of levels and become highly research active, those who want to at least. But actually doing that, the data sort of says they haven't quite done that yet. And just to give some sense of things, and so I have my copy of the report here, and I dog-eared a couple of pages. At the doctoral level, about 8.3% of institutions are HBCUs and MIs, and at the master's level, another 2.7% are HBCUs and MIs. And when you hear the percentages of funding going to those, and you look through, they're down in the 1% level. So again, it's not clear that the right metric is the number of universities versus the number of students, number of faculty, et cetera. But we're way off in terms of what HBCUs and MIs are doing. Okay, if we could go to the next slide, please. So we had a number of findings and conclusions that came out of this. We did a lot of data collection, as Jean mentioned. And generally speaking, and there are lots of tables and other things that support this, but we believe that current DoD programs are basically insufficiently funded if part of the goal is to enhance the capacity and competitiveness of HBCUs and MIs, and through the NDIA and through statements from places of the DoD, et cetera. It's because that Congress and DoD both are interested in increasing the capacity and competitiveness. There are discrepancies in the level, length, and type of funding that go to HBCUs and MIs versus others. So as we look and we say, well, what's the average length of a grant? What's the average size of a grant, et cetera? And there are many tables that collect all of this. We spent a lot of time working to try and collect those data. As Jean said, it was not easy. That's another problem, and you'll see that come up in the recommendations. And generally speaking, there was just a disconnect. I think, again, everybody wants to be doing more there, taking more advantage of that particular resource. But the data indicate that they don't. DoD is not taking advantage. Again, another table out of the report. This one's on page 93 that I found particularly compelling is if you look at the federal R&D funding at institutions of higher education, if you look at DoD funding and you say how much DoD funding is going to HBCUs, it's about 0.37% of the federal DoD research budget is going to HBCUs, and another 0.72% going to minority institutions. So 1% total. If you compare that to the total R&D funding, it's about 2% total across HBCUs and MIs for just R&D funding going to institutions. So not restricting to DoD. So that means that DoD is a factor of 2x less than what's going generally. So the DoD is not taking advantage of that capacity as much as the US is in general. Now, part of that you can say, well, yeah, but that includes funding from agencies that are not mission focused. But if you look at the Department of Energy, which I think is a good one to compare to, the Department of Energy really pretty close to that average. About 1.9% of the Department of Energy's budget, research budget, R&D budget, is going to HBCUs and MIs. So the DoD is about 2x off from what other agencies are doing, from what the broad set of government is doing. And so that's part of our evidence, we think, that DoD is not taking advantage of HBCUs and MIs at the level that it could. Okay, so next slide, please. As already pointed out, one of the things that's required is infrastructure to do that, experimental infrastructure and other things. And so we looked at that as well, things like the DURIP program that provide money for research instrumentation. And again, we found that that lags behind compared to the broad set of universities. So HBCUs and MIs get less of that money for those things that help build up that capacity. And we think there's interest. So, as we went and did some interviews and talked to people at HBCUs and MIs that want to become more research active or highly research active, that we believe there is a demonstrated ability and interest to do that. But those investments in infrastructure, personnel, administrative support, programmatic structure is something that needs to be done. And again, this is a place where I think industry can partner in interesting ways and help think about this. It's a little bit difficult sometimes, the way, as we all know, the way government, cuts up their dollars can make it difficult for them to just go spend money on some aspect of things. We're going to go help build up the IP office at some university because that's a necessary part of them getting more grants and contracts. Industry money might be a little bit more flexible that way. And you can say, look, we have a local university that we want to be more research active because we want them to be attracting more DoD dollars because we want to be hiring the workforce that they're training. Can we help them build up that expertise somehow? Can we help them through funding that? Can we help them through providing more guidance in terms of what we do in our government contracts office, for example, within an industry? So I think that's something for industry to think about. Okay, next slide, please. There are, of course, lots of challenges to do that. One of the things that we found out, or we felt as we went and talked to people, is that there's not enough two-way transfer of knowledge. HBCUs talking to people in DoD, DoD research sponsoring organizations and saying, here's what we need. And those research sponsoring organizations coming back and saying, here's where we're going. How do we work together to do things? Again, there's interest. The title of our report says transitioning from good intentions to measurable outcomes. And so I think there's good intentions, but getting those measurable outcomes is hard. And part of that is that this is very spread out within DoD. Some of it lives up sort of in Evelyn Kent's office. A lot of what happens in DoD, as those of us who are DoD active know, happens really at the level of the program managers and what goes on within AFOSR and ONR and ARO and the other agencies. And so making sure that that's really connected together and that we're getting the people on the ground who are doing the funding, thinking about how do I help build up the capacity at this HBCU MI seems like a very important thing to do. A lot of times you'll see things where, there has to be an HBCU MI as part of a team. Maybe it's a MURI or a UARC or something like that. I think we want to be careful about those, that it's not a just check the box exercise. What's the minimum number of dollars we can put into that and check that box so that it doesn't happen, but really is done in a substantive way where it's trying to build and advance the HBCU and MI capacities to conduct DoD research. And so as DoD thinks about how it should move forward, and we'll hear more from Victoria Coleman about things that the Air Force is doing, really building up that capacity should be part of what's going on. Okay, next slide, please. Reiterate, one of the findings was that it's not just about providing the money for the research, but also providing the money for the infrastructure, personnel, and programmatic support. And so thinking about how to do that, there may be opportunities to look at what other government agencies are doing. And we listed a number of programs within government agencies that seem to be highly effective, and DoD might look at those, but also thinking about how to cultivate longstanding collaborative relationships, right? So that either with a funding agency or with nearby universities or within a geographic area, how can we really help build up the programs and practices that are needed to do that? All right, next slide, please. So, and this is the last one on sort of findings. So overall, there needs to be long-term, so we need to commit to doing this and doing it over a period of time that allows HBCUs and MIs to build things up. And so there needs to be a long-term commitment to doing that. And again, right, not just the research, but also the things that are needed to do research. And finally, and Jean made this point, and I'm sure Farouk will bring it up also, one of the difficulties was it was a huge amount of effort to get the data to try and understand what's really going on. It's spread across different funding agencies. It's spread across all sorts of, kind of disparate places, and it's not collected in the same way. And so we had to go out and basically, manually collect all of that stuff and parse it and do other things. We got great help there from IDA. But it really was something that the government should do a better job at. DoD should do a better job at. Government, parts of government do. NSF collects exactly the sort of data, and their data sets were very useful to us. That's needed. There are national data sets for doing this. DoD should make use of it. Okay, so that's kind of at a high level. Sorry for being a little bit preachy about it, but the things that we found that led to a number of recommendations. So if we go to the next slide, and then the slide after that. So our first recommendation was to increase the funding, around increasing the funding for capacity building. We broke this up into three pieces. One is this long-term institutional support, providing money for physical research infrastructure, for research support and personnel, things like sponsored project tech transfer, the administrative and technical support, programmatic support to research faculty and students, for example, reduction of teaching loads, giving them training in how to write DoD grants and contracts, incentives for conducting more DoD research, and business information technology support. You're just getting grant management systems that can be highly effective, so you don't spend all of your time trying to write reports and figure out what the budgets are and other things. There are good systems for doing that, and that requires an investment to do that. And again, long-term support. This is a university that's going to do that. We're going to partner with them. We want them to generate capacity into the defense enterprise. Next slide, please. So the second recommendation along those lines is that just to recognize that the annual increases are one way to do that, but they have largely remained flat. And so the S&T dollars, if you look at it, adjusted for inflation, are not going up. And so just carving up a pie differently is not necessarily the best way to do that. There really needs to be real growth in what that S&T budget is if we want to help HBCUs. There may also be non-S&T funds, right? Again, if you're trying to do the infrastructure that goes along with this, maybe that can come from different types of development funds and different types of ways of building institutional capacity. Again, some of that's constrained by what the law allows and what Congress allows in the way that they break up the funds. That, again, may be an area where industry can help for HBCUs and MIs that you have relationships with. Next slide, please. Recommendation 1C was that putting the money in the military department S&T programs so that those people are more in direct contact with the HBCUs was something that we thought would be a good idea. That is, the money sort of sitting a little bit at the top within OSD, and yet the programs that are going to eventually fund that research are sitting down within the agencies. And so thinking about how to make sure that the military departments, the Army, Air Force, and Navy and Marines have money in their program offices, and that they're in direct contact. So we're not just saying, oh, go talk to OSD if you'd like to tap into this, but rather talk to your program manager in your research area. He or she can really help you do this. Okay, so increasing the funding for capacity building was one set of recommendations. And then the next set, there are, I think, another 5 to go. I will hand over to Farouk Alvi to talk about. So Farouk, over to you. You might be muted, Farouk.
And okay, is that better?
Yep, we can hear you. Yep.
So thank you very much for good morning, everyone, and thank you for the opportunity to share the results of our study. Jean gave a great introduction, and Richard did a very nice job of summarizing what we found. And as you see, that there's a significant discrepancy between what the capacity is and what the contributions of HBCUs and MIs, the contributions that they make versus the resources they get to support and grow research. So we had 4, well, actually 7 recommendations. So I'm going to try to go quickly through the rest of them. Go to the next slide, recommendation 2. So one of the challenges we had was, and this is partly related to data collection, and I'll get to that in the next recommendation, but when we're trying to improve capacity, we need to know what the current capacity is and what's working and what's not working well. So and to have long-term growth, you need to have relationships between those who are funding and those who are doing the work. And the funding really comes from the individual divisions of the Department of Defense. And you may direct someone to provide funding on a given year, but for it to be continued organically, they need to develop the relationship. So we think that we should have much more direct contact between the military departments that need the research and need the workforce and HBCUs, MIs. Of course, at the top level, the oversight should be provided by the HBCU office at DoD. But we need to build close relationships that can continue on their own beyond directives that come from the top. Next slide, please. So I think we mentioned this, Jean mentioned this, and so did Richard. One of the challenges that we had was to really understand what the current state of affairs was, what programs are working, what were not working. Getting consistent, reliable data that was comparable across the different branches was challenging. And this was not due to a lack of effort on the agency's part or support from DoD. It was just that it was not collected, and it was not collected in a way that was uniform. So this recommendation has to deal with really collecting better data, more consistent, so that we can assess what is working, what's not working, and do that over a long period. So as the first recommendation 3A says that now data should be collected in a consistent manner across all the departments, so we can see, we can compare which ones are doing well, which is not doing well, and perhaps learn from each other. We need to have much more coordination in that, and whatever data is collected across the DoD, which needs to be much more uniform, but it should also be consistent with some of the other agencies like NIH and NSF and DOE that fund significant amount of research at HBCUs, MIs, and universities in general, which again allows us to have a better comparison base and learn lessons from other agencies as well, which have very extensive research support. We believe that to be able to do this, we should have a directive from the Undersecretary of Defense, Research Engineering, to allow this data collection to really codify this, so that the individual branches can start requiring this data from the funding from the various departments as well as the institutions that they are funding. Overall, the challenge that the committee faced over and over was that we did not have consistent data, and we did not have longitudinal data. So if you were to see that there were some investments made in a certain period, you could not really evaluate what the impact was over the long term or the short term. So consistent, reliable, longitudinal data is very important to better guide policy and be able to invest in programs that work and improve those that do not work as well. Next slide, please. So continuing on with improved data collection. We talked about research capacity, building research capacity in institutes of higher education. So that really requires, what do we mean by research capacity? And I think a better definition is critical to better data collection. Like we say, you have to define the problem before you go about solving it. And that again was something that we came across in the process, that it was difficult. We struggled with how does one define research capacity. Now it is direct research infrastructure, kind of buildings and hardware, diagnostics, testing, analysis someone has. But equally important is what sort of administrative support infrastructure you have, because if you cannot execute contracts and grants, then you cannot really go to the next level and do the research. Richard also spoke, one of the component was, for example, what are the teaching loads as HBCU MIs versus the the PWIs. So it's important that we define what research capacity is, and then be able to track that carefully. That will allow us to develop metrics, targets that we want to hit, and be able to compare what HBCUs MIs are, where they are with respect to other institutions, and then develop long-term programs to meet those targets. One of the, this is a sidebar, this is my comment. All of this will require more time and overhead investment on the Department of Defense side, as well as the institutions. You're going to ask them to collect more data, deeper dive. So that's additional overhead. So I think we should be aware that when we're requiring more information and something that requires more administrative overhead, we are also aware of the fact that we are addressing institutions that are already struggling with support infrastructure. So these increased requirements must come with increased support. Otherwise, you're going to just make a problem, in my view, that's much worse. So better data should come with better support to collect that data from DoD. Next slide, please. So one of the best ways to really build long-term research capacity is to have partnerships. Caltechs and Georgia Techs and other well-established institutions that are very successful in executing research, University of Maryland, just don't do this on their own, but they really have a network that they work with. So there's a network that we talked about earlier in our recommendation within the DoD. So they have direct contact from the funding agencies, but there's also a network within the universities because that can leverage each other's strengths and collaborate. What we found is that although if you look at any call that comes out from the DoD, there is encouragement to work with MIs and HBCUs. But the committee did not find any specific examples where there was a direct carrot, like a weighted metric saying that if you do partner with this, you will get extra points in the evaluation criteria, or perhaps you'll get additional resources. We think all of those should be considered, and that partnership should be evaluated at the end. Did it lead to any growth in productivity in the research infrastructure, which actually relates to the previous recommendation that we develop metrics of how you define research capacity. In the metrics case, then you can evaluate the additional investment that's going in. And one of the additional way we could do that is to have carrots that incentivize true partnerships. That means not only are you going to make sure that HBCUs are getting challenges, are true partners in terms of the problems that they're working on, in terms of student participation in that, but also getting the resource to execute that. And in some cases, the resource, they may require additional resources because they're already challenged in terms of the research infrastructure. So, and I think this is where, again, Richard mentioned earlier, industry can perhaps play a part because sometimes the defense contracts are limited in what you can do with them. The next recommendation, we'll discuss that perhaps we need to look at other pipelines from the DoD side, but industry has more flexibility sometimes where they can hopefully provide more resources in these partnerships that help address long-term problems in capacity building. In the end, and I'm not going through each of these one by one because you have the report and you have these slides. I'm trying to really focus on the highlights. There should be some sort of descriptive tool that captures what our capabilities are. We've said this over and over in the report and in our earlier recommendation. That way, if we have, when we're looking for partners, when either Lockheed Martin or Boeing or the Air Force is looking for certain skills and resources, they can go to that use that tool and find out who has that kind of capacity. Next slide, please. So continuing the true partnership. And this is, I'm at the nexus of an R1 and an HBCU, Florida State University and Florida A&M University. So I have seen the challenges and the rewards of doing that. So this is kind of near and dear to me, that if you can really have true collaboration, then you can have significant impact beyond a specific program and beyond a specific contract or grant. And I think that's what the committee found that is lacking, that but it can be a very powerful tool if you invest in that. So one of the ways one could do that is to look at some programs that are already existing but can be enhanced. So depth score has worked fairly well in increasing capacity at some of the states that have not been as competitive. So perhaps you can look at programs like that, invest more in programs such as, and I'm going on to the next slide, but don't flip the slide yet. Programs such as the SMART Scholarship, where HBCU students and MI students are very underrepresented. If we can have targeted programs like that, or direct programs that are targeted towards HBCUs, but at significant scale, then I think we can have these opportunities and investments that are directed towards these institutions and allow them to grow. One of the challenges is that chicken and egg, as Richard mentioned, is that we want them to compete, but we're trying to address inequities that have been there for a very, very long time. Well, they cannot really compete on the same playing field unless they build that capacity to compete. So programs need to address that inequity so that at some point there will be a level playing field. And partnership between DoD and other agencies such as the NSF, DOE, NIH, learning from the programs that worked, as we mentioned earlier in this call, is that NSF, for example, has had some success in doing that, and they have a much higher fraction of their funding going to HBCUs and MIs. So the DoD could certainly learn from that and learn best practices, and then share this information across the different agencies, as well as across the various branches of DoD. Next slide, please. So this is fairly self-explanatory that USD, the Undersecretary of Defense's Research and Engineering programs, should really try to strengthen these partnerships explicitly. I mentioned some of that in the previous slide, but scholarships such as SMART that are where HBCUs and MI students are very underrepresented, but it would be a great way to enhance participation. One of the things that you are all well aware of, that the fraction of students that are at HBCUs and MIs who are national, who are US citizens, is much larger than the average institutions of higher learning. So if these students are offered these kind of fellowships, they'll have more who will take advantage of them, and then not only contribute to the research and development, but also be the future workforce. So we think that we should look at these programs much more carefully and see if we can target some of these more towards HBCUs and MIs. Other programs, for example, the NSF's Assure program is another good model that DoD can look at and expand access to. And we should also look at funding with co-funding, perhaps with the National Science Foundation and other agencies on programs that enhance capacity building at tribal colleges and universities. Next slide. Is this, there we go. So that summarizes, let me just say from my perspective, better data collection that is consistent across the agency, across DoD, the different branches of DoD, and longitudinal over time is important. It should have some consistency across federal agencies that fund HBCUs and MIs. We should have incentivized true partnerships between non-HBCUs and MIs and HBCUs and MIs through carrots and perhaps small sticks as well as with industry. Industry can play a bigger role in investing in places where DoD sometimes is restricted due to the contractual and legal requirements to build research capacity. And a lot of that can come from helping build infrastructure, not only physical, but administrative infrastructure, and providing training and support. And this needs to be done over a long period because we're trying to do this, address problems that have taken place for a long period. So perhaps I've gone over my time. Thank you very much.
Wonderful. I think we're going to go to, we've got some questions coming in. So if it's okay, I will present those questions to the committee. So let me start. Our first question comes asking, how could institutions with a high teaching load actually be incentivized? Because arguably high teaching load could relate to a high talent throughput for the defense industrial base. Anyone want to take that one?
Well, I will tell you, I can take a quick crack at it because our joint college is between FSU and FAMU. So in FSU, a typical teaching load is for research active faculty is 1+1 or 1+2, where FAMU can anywhere be from 4 to 8 per year, per academic year, right? So what we have to do is when you're issuing contracts and looking at grants that goes toward HBCUs, perhaps you can have additional resources that are set aside explicitly saying you will buy off one course load. So it could be part of the existing of grants that are only specific to HBCUs and MIs to buy off courses. Because if you wrap that in a traditional contract, it's just going to make it financially, it would not be viable. So it would have to be an additional resource to buy off courses that is targeted towards HBCUs and MIs. That's one of the recommendations that I would have.
Very good. Very good. Let's see, we have another question. So the committee report seemed to focus on HBCU MI programs. Okay. Why are the HBCU MIs not effectively competing in the broader program opportunities?
I can take it. So, I think what we found in the study was that there are lots of reasons, and again, I think a lot of it is that having that institutional capacity to do research, right? Do you have a sponsored contracts office that you can say, when I need to write a grant, I basically tell my grant manager, I need to write a grant. It needs to be $200K per year. I want to fund roughly this number of graduate students, this amount of materials and supplies. And an hour later, I get back, here's a budget for that, right? And great, we're going to go submit that. I mean, we have a fantastic group of people who does that for us. They're very hardworking. They know how the system works, et cetera. If that's true at all HBCU MIs, I think it'd be a lot easier. I know it's not true at some of the ones that I interact with. So I think, again, why aren't they? Well, part of it is that they have to be part of that ecosystem, right? Your program manager at AFSR calls you up and say, hey, we're having this meeting to figure out what the next research directions are. We want you to participate. You got to be part of that network in order to do that. I think there are lots of reasons, and in the report we call out many of them in that kind of 3 bubble framework. Those are the things that we think are required, and so I think you can go through and say, well, okay, again, I'll use my local institution, Cal State LA. I don't have the time to go to these meetings. Is there money for me to go travel to DC to participate in this conference? We don't have a sponsored contracts office where I have a dedicated grant manager who can just do this stuff for me, right? Those are the sorts of things that I hear.
Right, Richard captured it. So it's not a single. It's across of the various areas, but I'll tell you, administrative support and teaching loads are 2 main things that even if you have great ideas, you cannot translate. You may not have the infrastructure, you may not have the labs yet, but you have great ideas to build it. You can't write it because you have to teach 8 classes or 6 classes, and you don't have a program somebody in the sponsored research office who can help you because they may have 1 for every 2 faculty or 8 faculty, whereas at HBCU they may have 1 for every 50 faculty, and that's not an exaggeration. So, and guess where the funding for that comes from? Mostly from overhead that you collect on contracts and grants. So it is a challenging problem. That's why I think there has to be a separate program that really addresses building that. I would call it DURIP for administrative research support.
And a follow-on question, and Richard, this is directed at you. So are the HBCUs just not requesting DURIP funds and MURI funding, or are they not being selected for awards after submitting?
Yeah, wouldn't that be a great question to be able to answer? If only we had the data.
Yeah.
So, I mean, this is like, that's like the first question you ask, right? Is it because they're not applying, or is it because, right, they're not getting the money?
Yeah.
And the answer is DOD doesn't collect in any uniform way the statistics on who applies, right? You would think that the DOD program manager, the DOD generally would be able to say, here's how many white papers we got. Here's what the breakdown was by type of institution, Here's the number of actual proposals that we got based on the white papers. And here's what we funded. All we know is what's funded. And we got that from usaspending.gov, not from the DOD, right? And so it's a great question. I wish I knew the answer to it. A big part of the recommendation is these are the sorts of data that we need to collect, because you can't see, what your problems are if you're not measuring, right? Sort of what's going on in a big, complicated system.
Yes, absolutely. Let's see. We've got time for a couple more questions. One is, can you provide advice for a DoD-funded research center on how to identify the best minority-serving institutions from which to recruit and hire talent?
Farouk, Jean, you want to take that one?
So can you provide advice, Mark? Can you say the last part again?
Yeah, so the question is, can you provide advice on how to identify the best institutions from which to recruit and hire talent?
So how should people find you?
HBCUs and MIs? Right? Is that what you're asking?
Yeah.
Do I want to name them? No.
How would you find them though, right? If you want somebody to find you, how do I know? Right?
Oh,
yeah.
So I think the way you would define them is the ones that have had success in building long-term programs, not just getting one or two, and have shown success in training master's and PhD students, because that really is the workforce that's needed for many of the DoD programs. So long-term success over a period of 5 to 10 years is how you would define it. And I bet you, if you look at that, you'll find that those involve long-term relationships between the various DoD branches, as well as their other institutions, not just HBCUs, but other IHEs, Institute of Higher Education.
Very
and
good.
Again, I think we keep coming back to that. It is very difficult to get into this field without having a network and have continuous success. And we have to build that network.
Very good. Thank you.
I think it's also important to understand that, if we're talking about starting at an undergraduate level and moving on through the process, that at the early stages of accreditation for higher education institutions, especially I'm very familiar with engineering and the engineering accreditation process, that there are no separation between what the accreditation process is at any institution. And because these people graduate, and then if they take their first level job, especially if they're infrastructure people or whatever, they must work in teams. So I think if you look at it from a standpoint of the faculty at institutions, the same schools that are receiving DoD funding and so forth are the ones that produce faculty, even at HBCUs and MIs. So that these folks come from the major universities. However, when you talk about one course a semester and 2 courses a semester versus 4 courses a semester, it's a dedication or a commitment on the part of those faculty as to whether that's something they wanted to do for whatever reasons. So I think that's an interesting question, but we're really talking about continuity and places we can get people who might go into those areas like our national laboratories and our national defense endeavors. And in this case, we are talking about an absence of individuals who take their first education level exposure, especially in STEM, at HBCUs and MIs, and also TCU.
May I say one last thing?
Sure, and then we'll make that the last word for this.
The reason, because this is the industry consortium, I do want to emphasize that industry can play a bigger, much bigger role. And part of that is long-term partnerships and investments, not, not giving a big lump sum. I mean, you can give an injection of funds one time, but really to be able to have growth over the long period and address this problem, you need to be patient and have long-term partnerships. And I think that's what they should really focus on. I think that would have an impact that is beyond my career and Richard's career and your career if we're going to make an impact.
That's a great closing point. That's also going to be a wonderful feeder to the next part of this webinar. We're at in 10 minutes we're going to have a panel discussion where industry interaction will be a key. But before that, it is first my duty to thank the panel. Thank you for this report. Thank you for giving us the outbrief on what your findings and conclusions were. Extremely impactful. I think it's gonna resonate across the department. So again, thanks for joining us this morning. It is now my incredible honor to introduce Dr. Victoria Coleman, who is the Chief Scientist of the United States Air Force. In that role, she serves as the Chief Scientific Advisor to the Secretary of the Air Force, the Chief of Staff of the Air Force, and the Chief of Space Operations. Prior to assuming the role of Chief Scientist of the Air Force, Dr. Coleman was the 22nd Director of DARPA. And of course, in that role, she oversaw a large suite of disruptive, innovative programs. And prior to that was a member of the Defense Science Board, so truly understands our critical issues in science technology for national defense. Some brief biographical notes. Dr. Coleman is on leave from the University of California, Berkeley, where since 2016, she's held an academic research appointment, leading science technology policy on microelectronics and efforts to develop tools for countering digital authoritarianism. Dr. Coleman has more than 35 years of experience in computer science technology. She started at age 5, by the way, including as both an academic leader and industry executive. Before DARPA, she was the Chief Executive Officer of Atlas AI, PBC, was a Silicon Valley startup working on world-class artificial intelligence solutions. She's also been the CTO of the Wicca Media Foundation, the Director of the System Design Laboratory at SRI International, the Vice President of Software Engineering at Hewlett-Packard, and Nokia's Vice President of Emerging Platforms. So in a nutshell, someone who understands industry, understands academia, understands government, and has been a thought leader in this initiative to energize the department's work with HBCUs. So without further ado, Victoria, over to you.
Thank you, Mark. Thank you to NDIA and also ETI for the wonderful opportunity to come and talk to you today about this work that is deeply meaningful to myself and the broader team within the DoD. Also, I want to say thank you to Richard Murray and his colleagues for the study, the National Academy study, which was an inspiration for the work that we did subsequently. And also, I noticed that Lenora Gant is on the call, and Lenora, you were at the start of all this. So thank you for that. So what I wanted to do in the next 10 minutes is,
Vicky.
It's good to hear your voice. So what I wanted to do was to tell you a little bit about the plan that we have hatched in the Department of the Air Force and the DoD more broadly, which for many of us truly is a work of love and dedication. And it's kind of interesting. Those of you that have worked in the government, in the Pentagon, you will know that we don't often agree on things. Like, we mostly disagree on things, except for this one. In this case, we had an amazing team pulled together from across the department to make this a reality. It all started from really looking at some of the data that was coming out of the study that was just briefed. We understood that there was a significant problem, and we set about understanding more broadly, what the issue was and what would be an instrument that would allow us to begin to be responsive to the problem set. And we did that by talking certainly within the department, but then also talking to a number of institutions outside, as well as folks like Lenora and others that understand deeply the kind of the environment within these schools are trying to be successful. So, after many months of work and study and so on, we decided to go forward and establish a York University affiliated research center, which will be led by an HBCU. Hopefully, not hopefully, I mean, our intent is that it will be led by one institution, but that institution will bring with it a consortium. And the focused area of the York will be in tactical autonomy. So in doing this, what we're trying to line up are a number of different kind of factors that are material to us. First and foremost, autonomy, in particular tactical autonomy, which fieldable autonomy is something that is critical to the success of the mission in the Department of the Air Force. So that was kind of the first pillar, if you like, of the strategy. The other one has to do with growing our own organic technical excellence in the Department of the Air Force. I mean, we all recognize, our secretary has recognized that from the day he walked into the building, that we have fallen behind in having enough STEM talent and expertise inside of the department to support our mission. So we know that we need to bring in more scientists and engineers. At the same time, we also know that we have a diversity, challenge. So this UARC gives us the opportunity to kill, two birds with one stone, I guess, both increase our STEM talent and the diversity in that STEM talent that we're hoping to bring in. So that was not pillar 2. Pillar 3 is all about building capacity in institutions, again, inspired by the work that National Academy Studies brought forth. So, we understand the limitations that these schools have. We understand that they're always being asked to do more with less. And we said, well, enough of that already. Let's do something about it. I guess the ambition in terms of capacity, and I noticed earlier on there was quite a bit of discussion on the chat about R1s, R2s. The ambition is to have at least one school emerge as an R1 institution as a result of the York work. There are 11 R2 institutions today. There are no R1s that are HBCUs, and we would like to change that. So this slide here, and thank you for changing it over, talks about the objectives. And as I said, creative autonomy, research in science and engineering, enhancing early career development for STEM professionals to come into the department to help us, diversify the pool. And also, more broadly, build a lasting partnership between the department and the HBCUs. We know that, there are a number of programs that the AFRL, for example, and the OSR in particular have built out over the years that support collaboration with HBCUs. What we're going to do here, and we've been very kind of, deliberate on this, is we want to create a partnership that will last decades. This UARC will be funded for an initial period of 5 years and will be renewable for another term of five years. And we are funding it at $12 million a year. We hope that this is the start, not the end. We're hoping that the institutions, as they start spinning up their own capacity and capability along the lines that Richard and Farouk spoke about earlier, that this will create a flywheel that will actually attract even more funding than that. If we go to the next slide, I'll tell you a little bit about what we're looking for, and the BAA is out in the street. We'll speak about that in a moment. But what we're asking the institutions to put forward are the qualifications, their ideas, their aspirations in terms of technology, and the focus areas that we're looking at is trust in mission autonomy. And that means two things. It means collaboration between platforms. We want trust kind of when you have just two platforms trying to figure out how to execute the mission. But then more broadly, we also want to understand how a human and machine team together to deliver better results when you have autonomy in the mix as opposed to otherwise. The consortium piece that I mentioned is well, it will be limited in the sense that it has to be led by an R2 school. So the schools that apply to be the lead institutions have to be in R2s, but then there are no restrictions in the consortium. And we're hoping the broader it is, the better. We also have an additional twist in this program. We're building in a partnership with the NPP, which is a program out of the Undersecretary of Defense for Acquisition and Sustainment. NPP stands for Mentor Protege Program, and maybe some of the folks on the call here are familiar with it already. The idea there is that large established companies that do business with the Defense Department can help smaller companies, learn the tricks and begin to also be successful. Our goal in putting the two together is to create, pockets of economic activity, small businesses and so on around each one of the schools that will participate in the consortium. Our vision is that it will be, like the equivalent of Pittsburgh's robotic row in each one of the places that the consortium members are present. And finally, the STEM education requirement is a significant one for the proposals. We want the schools to develop programs to educate more people. We want them to increase the pool of candidates from which the Air Force and the department more broadly hire. We're not going to ask. We're not going to hold them accountable for how many people we'll hire, because that's down to us. But we do want to hold them accountable for building a bigger pool from which we can hire. If you go to the next slide, this is our timeline. So, and it's not shown here, but it's a date that is stuck in my head. With the red letters on the 22nd of March, Secretary Kendall approved the creation of the UARC. A team came together led by Tim Williams, who's here on the call and can also answer some questions. It's a joint team across the Air Force, also with participation from USDR&E as well as ANS, and also PNR, Personnel and Readiness. So this is really a broad coalition of people in the department. BAA hit the street on September 6th. There were celebrations, loud cheers when that happened. On the 19th of September, the written comments period will close, and then we are looking to receive proposals on November 7th and make a decision and a selection on the 15th of December. We believe that Secretary Austin will personally announce the winner of the competition, and that I say that because for us that worked this, and that's a very important validation, but also I think it shows the commitment and the degree of support that this effort has within the department. So in many ways, I want this to be the first thing, not the last thing we do. And everything that I've seen in the department so far makes me believe that will in fact be the case. With that, I think go to the next slide, and we can talk a little bit about how we intend to run this. In the run-up to the creation of the UARC, we spent a lot of time talking to existing UARCs. We talked to their sponsors. We got a sense for what works, what doesn't work. And one of the things that was clear to us is that unless there is a very tight partnership between the UARC and the department, it's easy for things to diverge, for the UARC to go off and do things that the department doesn't particularly care about. And then all the goodness that we expect to get from the UARC doesn't materialize. So to make sure that this does not happen in this case, we are creating an executive steering group within the department that will have representation from the Air Force, and not except from the Air Force, certainly from my office, but also from our Office of Diversity and Inclusion, from personnel and readiness at the OST level, research and engineering, as well as acquisition and sustainment. So they will be representation that will have ex officio members. So, when people change out, there will be continuity. And that group will be there for the long haul to continue building out the partnership, supporting the institutions as they build out their own work. So, we really truly intend for this to be a team sport. We are so excited. We've had a number of events in the run-up to the publication of the BAA to explain to the community what it is that we were after. We've got lots of questions. I think the first meeting we had 70 or 80 people. The second meeting was on the same order. Third meeting we had over 100 people participate. So what I said to them when we had our in-person meeting at the BRIC about a month ago, and I'll say it here, is our hearts are full. I mean, I am just so excited that finally we're at the point where we can do this. And I also said to them that I hope that their head is on fire, right? They need to go off now and build on this and put forth proposals that will make our eyes water. With that, I wanted to conclude my remarks, pass it back to Mark, again with my thanks to everybody here for the opportunity to have this conversation. Thank you.
Victoria, thank you so much for that explanation. Also, thank you so much for actually championing this effort. You're actually the reason that we are all here today. So without further ado, I want to introduce our panel. We're going to have a panel discussion that will be led by Michelle Atkinson, who is the Director of Federal Relations, Senior National Security Strategist, but also one of the leaders of NDIA's Science and Engineering Technology Division, which is our partner in sponsoring this event today. Dr. Atkinson serves as Director of Federal Relations, as I said, for the University of Texas System. And in that role, her responsibilities include developing strategies, research partnerships, and formal agreement opportunities, with a special focus on working with the DoD. Before assuming that role, Dr. Atkinson served in leadership positions with Lockheed Martin Corporation and in the military. Among her corporate roles, she led strategic partnership development for Lockheed Martin Advanced Technology Laboratories and Washington operations, focused on accelerating technology transition efforts. In her military roles, Michelle served for 27 years in a variety of military command and senior staff positions, including at U.S. Joint Forces Command as the Chief Scientist for the Air Force Experimentation Office and as Senior Advisor for the Air Force Command and Control, Intelligence, Surveillance, and Reconnaissance Center. So Michelle, thank you so much for joining us today. Thank you for chairing this panel, and I will turn it over to you.
Thank you, Mark. Hopefully everybody can hear me. It's my pleasure to be able to moderate the panel today, made up of very distinguished panelists. And for brevity of time, I just want to highlight each of our panelists and then get right into the discussions to hear their perspectives on today's topics. First, from our industry, we have Dr. Reginald Brothers, who is the Chief Executive Officer for Big Bear AI. Dr. Brothers has served as an Executive Vice President and Chief Technology Officer for Peraton and as a principal with the Chertoff Group. He has also served as the Undersecretary for Science and Technology at DHS and as Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Research in DoD. He is a distinguished fellow of the Georgetown University Center for Security and Emerging Technology and a member of the MIT Laboratory Advisory Board. J.R. Edwards, our second industry panelist, serves in the Lockheed Martin Chief Technology Office, where he is responsible for the external technology advisory function for Lockheed. Previously, he served as the manager for human space flight programs and founded Lockheed Martin's Global Space Exploration Outreach and Advocacy Program. In fact, next week, he will become the 10th American and only the second African American to be inducted into the International Astronautical Federation Hall of Fame. Mr. Edwards is a permanent observer, representative to the United Nations, and serves on the boards of the National Institute of Aerospace, Explore Mars, and Student for exploration and space development. Our academic panelists, our first one is Dr. Willie May, who serves as Vice President for Research and Economic Development at Morgan State University. He previously served as Undersecretary of Commerce for Standards and Technology and as Director of the National Institute for Standards and Technology. He began his career as a chemist at NIST and his work has been described in more than 90 peer reviews, and he has given more than 250 invited lectures at conferences around the world. Dr. May serves on the board of directors for Consumer Reports and the Maryland Technology Development Corporation Innovation Initiative, and he serves as a science committee member on NASA's advisory council, and as well has served as vice president for the International Committee on Weights and Measures. Our second academic panelist is Jacqueline Shaw, who is serving as the vice president for research, economic development, and knowledge enterprise, and is the associate vice president for strategic research initiatives at the University of Texas, San Antonio. She has served in various roles, including the Chief Operating Officer for the Cybersecurity Manufacturing Innovation Institute, and is an advisor to the National Security Collaboration Center and the School of Data Science. Before joining UTSA, Jacqueline served in multiple roles in MedStar Health, which is the Mid-Atlantic's largest healthcare system. She was responsible for the operational management of public health arm of St. Mary's Hospital, and she has served as the emergency manager in Southern Maryland and held the position of chair of the TRICARE Homeland Security Council for Emergency Management Agency. With that, I would ask each of our panelists to please provide a 5-minute summary or highlight that they would like to contribute to the audience today on the topics and the subjects that we have covered both in the presentations and in the study. So I would like to start with Dr. Brothers.
Michelle, really appreciate it. Good to see you, and thanks for being here. I also want to thank the for the report, excellent report, and want to thank Dr. Coleman for the excellent work on the UARC. I think these are all excellent advances in pulling HBCU MIs into the larger ecosystem. And I kind of want to start, and I will keep this brief, with where Mark left us off when he was motivating this whole piece. And kind of going back to 1945, right? Vannevar Bush, the science and the endless frontier. Talking about the importance of radar and technological advances in World War II, going to 1953 and the first offset strategy and coming up through the strategic nuclear effects for that first offset, to precision weaponry for second offsets, to AI, electronic warfare, hypersonics, these kinds of things for the so-called third offset. And the reason why I say that is because if we go back to first principles, what's really important for our national security and defense is technological innovation, right? And so when I was thinking about this, I started looking at where we rank worldwide with respect to that and how those things are measured. So if you look, for example, at the Global Innovation Institute's research, right, they'll talk about a number of different measures of innovation. So one is the investment in R&D as a percentage of GDP per capita. Another is the ranking of S&T clusters. What's an S&T cluster? Well, an example of an S&T cluster is Silicon Valley. Another one is New York. Another one is Boston, Cambridge. And these three in particular are in the top 10 of the world's S&T clusters. A third measurement is S&T intensity, and that has to do with per capita S&T activity. Now, the reason why I mention these is because from a national security perspective, it's important that we engage as many folks in this country as possible to maintain our advantage. But I'd argue we have to engage them in the right way, right? In the right way. So if we say what is essential, what is really essential to engage HBCU MIs, because they supply like 30% of Black graduates in science, engineering, doctorate degrees? What's the right way? Let me tell you a quick story. So when I was at DARPA, an opportunity to be invited to go to the Navy postgraduate school. And I was invited to go there to observe an exercise with the Army Rangers. And they had this really interesting device, right? It was a ruggedized iPad. And I was there, I met with the, I actually walked around with the squad leader as they were going through their exercise. And the squad leader, he actually hated this thing, which is surprising to me because I thought this was outstanding, right? He was the situational awareness, right? The common operational picture to every dismount, right? This is kind of the goal, right? Well, the problem was, at this time anyway, passive touchscreen. And so Army Ranger, what in their hands? There were gloves, right? So it was somewhat useless. The stylus that the engineers gave him, well, that wasn't very useful when he's got weapons and comms and gloves and all these other kinds of things on. And during the daytime, the screen, well, the sun blew out the screen. At night, the light of the screen gave away their position. So it didn't work. And the reason why I say all this is because I think the best way to engage with universities or any creative individual in order to get a real innovation that's important to the Department of Defense is to engage with the users. I think that's absolutely essential. And I think I've taken that lesson with me ever since that happened. This user insight is essential to move beyond inventions to innovations. So what I'd like to do then is give you a couple of examples of what I think are some best practices that I've seen, not so much for engaging with HBCUs, but engaging with colleges in general. So one is called the MIT BeaverWorks. And here you've got MIT campus, partners with MIT Lincoln Laboratory to provide real world problems, right, from the user based on what the folks at MIT Lincoln Labs are doing, to provide capstone courses to campus. So now you are actually providing our campus students with, no kidding, real world problems, just like what Dr. Coleman's doing with the UARC on tactical autonomy, right? Real world problems. So that they understand what these problems are, and they're already building this kind of background. There's building this kind of interest and excitement for working department problems. Another one, and Jacqueline, you'll appreciate this, is, and Michelle as well, UTSA NSCC, right? The National Security Collaboration Center, right? And this is exciting, I believe, because it's something that the UTSA has worked with the city of San Antonio, as well as the port of San Antonio, as well as others, to bring together government, academia, and industry to start understanding real world problems and how to solve them in a collaborative manner. A third one is the MIT Ai Accelerator, right? This is one that's sponsored by the Air Force, gets high marks by the Air Force from people I know. And that's because it's the Air Force provides use cases. And it's, again, it's a collaboration between Lincoln and MIT, real world use cases. Another one, the DHS, we have centers of excellence. Centers of excellence, they're not just funded for research, but there's oversight of the DHS component. So that's CBP, it could be FEMA, it could be the Coast Guard, et cetera. So these centers of excellence, this academic research, has the oversight and the context of use cases. Now, one of the things that I'd like to ask, so I think those are some best cases, but I'd also like to ask is, can we be bolder than that? Can we be bolder than that? So I mentioned earlier this whole idea of the S&T clusters. Well, another phrase for that is innovation districts. There's been a lot of research in that, right? My question then is, can we then, as we're building up infrastructure and these kinds of things like the report talked about, can we expand our thought to not just the university, but a broader ecosystem with a public-private partnership? So can DoD, can industry come together on that, like they did in some sense with the Manufacturing Innovation Institutes, to really build out research innovation districts? And what these include, this is where you have it could be one or multiple research institutions. It's a number of businesses. It's the infrastructure, right, that you need. It's the density. There's been a lot of research in this area. And so my question to this group and others is, why can't we aspire to that? We know that goes on a number of different universities. Can we try to incentivize a public-private partnership to do that for HBCU MIs? Because I'd argue that it's not just, what we need is not just basic research, but it's mature capabilities at market prices, right? That's what's going to drive the capabilities of DoD beyond just prototypes and demonstrations, but to no kidding, real capabilities. So I'd like us to be bold and investigate all the things that were talked about in the report. Love the UARC as well. And then can we take that to a step further to an entire ecosystem? I'll stop there and look forward to Q&A on why we can't do that.
Okay, thank you very much, Reggie. And now I'd like to ask J.R. Edwards to provide his summary comments.
Sure, thank you, Michelle. I'd like to join Dr. Brothers in offering a few thank yous. I'd like to thank Dr. Coleman for the department's vision, leadership, and initiative. Thank you for acknowledging this great opportunity space and for acknowledging the great talent and intellect among our HBCU MIs. Your vision and initiative will provide greater access and pathways for direct engagement. Thank you to the Honorable David Norquist and the NDIA team for NDIA's leadership. Thank you to the National Academies for their great work leading to the findings and recommendations. And thank you to Dr. Mark Lewis, Michelle, and team of Emerging Technologies Institute for inviting us to be part of this discussion. I'd like to start with, in a world where Don LaFontaine was an American voice actor who recorded more than 5,000 film trailers and hundreds of thousands of television advertisements, network promotions, video game trailers. And in a 2007 interview, he explained the strategy behind his signature catchphrase, "in a world where." He said, "We have to rapidly establish the world we are transporting them to." All of us who are involved in this rich S&T ecosystem enjoy the special privilege of rising each day with visions of in a world where, right? Fill in the blank, and working toward that end. So I celebrate our academicians, administrators, and staff within the HBCU MIs who are educating, inspiring, and mentoring our great talent who will guide us forward. Thank you for helping them and all of us to imagine a world where. In my role as lead for Lockheed Martin's technology advisory functions under our CTO, Dr. Steve Walker, I am transported each day as I work with our teams to think in most visionary ways about the future of tech 10, 20, 30 years out and beyond, and pull that vision into present day. Engagement with the HBCU MIs are core to our innovation and growth strategy. So just as Dr. Coleman described the department's executive steering committee, we bring an enterprise approach to how we engage, partner, and collaborate, from our corporate diversity and inclusion group to our MSI Universities engagement group, within our corporate university relations and recruitment group to our university engagement group, within the chief technology office to supply chain to business areas and on down the line. You get the idea. Within our chief technology office, we are very much focused on three areas. First, cultivating disruptive technologies for 21st century security technology domains. Second, partnering for university engagement-enabled co-crad pursuits. And third, leveraging university research to partner. We have designated leads who develop and guide our strategy and work directly with our partners. I'd also like to highlight that the National Academy's emphasis on fostering true partnerships really resonates with us. Our distinguished panelists pointed to recommendation 4A and the flexibility that industry might have in shaping and forming partnerships with HBCUs and MIs. At Lockheed Martin, we are very much in agreement, and we are about the business of being about the business. The department's HBCU initiative is really, really significant to address the point that our good friend Richard Murray mentioned earlier regarding funding availability for overhead activities that would enable sort of heightened levels of engagement. I am pleased to share that our advanced technology laboratories under the leadership of Dr. Robbie Mandelbaum has already stepped forward to offer both programmatic and financial support to enable HBCU MI participation through the upcoming fall NDIA activities as part of this national focus. It is crucial that we not only avow the importance of HBCU MI engagement, but that we act and enable. And we challenge our industry counterparts to do likewise. To our good friend Farouk, as an immediate response to your call for longer-term industry partnerships and investments, we hear you, and we are continuing our engagement in furtherance of this goal. We recognize that this is a journey. Dr. Coleman, our hair is on fire as we sprint forward to meet the challenges of today and the future. We support your comments regarding the broad coalition, and we are pleased to walk this journey with members of the community and the broader ecosystem. I'll pause here.
Okay, thank you very much. Now I would like to transition to our academic representatives on the panel, and let's start with Dr. Willie May.
Okay. Good morning. First of all, I'd like to also be a bit redundant and thank the Academy for this very, very timely and thorough report, and to thank Dr. Coleman for this game-changing opportunity for HBCUs to increase not only their research capacity, but to contribute to our national defense and our international competitiveness. We will not collect, on behalf of the HBCU community, we will not let the Air Force down. Let me say something about HBCUs. As everyone knows, we were mostly established to provide education to recently freed slaves. But over our time of existence, some of us have developed very credible research program, and there are about 5 of us that are poised to become R1 research universities within the next decade. However, for all HBCUs, we take students where they are and take them where they have to be to contribute to our national defense and our international competitiveness. Next slide, please. But has been shown, has been demonstrated, we have not been getting our fair share of the resources. This doesn't speak only to defense money from DOD, but money from the federal government per se, that over the last decade or so, there's been a 20% increase in funding to the academic sector. But for HBCUs, there's been a 20% decrease. And in the beginning, we were only getting about less than 1%, and that has really decreased. And that does not speak, let's not talk about only about fairness. That does not position our country in a very good place to be competitive internationally. Next slide. HBCUs have a value proposition. As been stated earlier, we make up less than 5% of academic institutions in this country, yet we provide about 1/4 of the BS degrees to Black students in STEM fields. According to the American Institute of Research, more than 1/3 of the Blacks who receive a STEM PhD actually got their undergraduate training at an HBCU. So these organizations are a national treasure, and they must be supported if this country is to remain competitive as we go forward. Next slide. My statement, and I think I've just said that, so I don't need to repeat it. Next slide. Okay, I think that was the end of my initial comments. I'll close by saying this issue of HBCUs receiving a greater share of the resources, again, is not just a fairness issue, it's an international competitiveness issue. I remember back when I was in elementary school, actually, when the Russians launched Sputnik, there was a national call to service. That was a great amount of funding that went into the university system in the US to make the greatest university system on the face of the earth, because we had this existential commitment to beat the Russians to space. That great public university system attracted some of the best minds from across the world here. And many of them stayed here and they became US citizens, and they contributed to our economy and our national competitiveness. In the last decade or so, that is changing. Many of those folks are deciding to go home, and many of them are being offered unbelievable packages to come home and support their country. So investing in our homegrown talent has become increasingly important because Black folks don't have another home to go back to. This is our home. And we are very excited about contributing to this country's competitiveness. And we really accept the challenge. We are very, very grateful that the DoD has decided to step up their game, increase its investment in HBCUs. And again, the Air Force for their decision, and the DoD to support this HBCU-led UARC to allow us to, again, contribute to our nation's defense and our international competitiveness. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. May. And now I'd like to invite Jacqueline Shaw to provide comment.
Good morning. I'd first like to thank Dr. Coleman and team for hosting this engagement this morning. And it's an honor to sit alongside Reggie, JR, and Willie on this panel. And thank you, Michelle, for coordinating. I feel like after listening to all the speakers this morning that my best role here is to give insight from a Hispanic serving institution that has learned the hard way on a lot of the findings that the report discussed this morning lays out for others in front of us. So the University of Texas at San Antonio is a recently designated R1 institution by Carnegie. We're 54 years old, so we made it in rapid time. And we wouldn't have gotten there if it had not been for our Department of Defense partners. So we're lucky in the fact that we're located in a city where the demand signal the education and research drive of the university. And not all institutions across the nation have that. University of Texas at San Antonio does. And so a lot of the effort that we put into partnering with the Department of Defense and serving and being there and being a solution for pipeline development and also technology advancements has been through our partnerships that we've built locally. A Hispanic serving institution in Texas, there's many of us. There's actually 569 in the US. 2/3 of Latinx or Hispanic students at the undergraduate level receive their degrees from HSIs. And by 2026, they expect to have 4.1 million Hispanic students in HSIs across the country. So it really is a pipeline development tool for all federal agencies, but particularly the Department of Defense. We have 21, please advance next slide. So there are 21 in total R1 Hispanic serving institutions in the nation. And so just recently, within the last 12 months, these 21 R1 HSIs came together to create the Alliance of Hispanic Serving Research Institutions. And this is a powerful coalition, and they're still trying to learn how to work together. And we're doing things together like coming to DC as a team, not in our silos, not state by state, but by a collective, to understand the federal problems and to understand how we can respond as a team. And you can see that they're located mainly along the south and southwest corridor of the US, but we anticipate that the number of Carnegie R1s are going to grow intensely in the years to come, given there are more than 560 in the country, but only 21 of them are R1s. So for the HBC community and their effort to become an R1, some of these institutions have already learned that the hard way and gone through the motions. And I think that they hope to be a source of information and guidance throughout your process and your journey forward. Next slide, please. And as Reggie mentioned, in San Antonio, we do have a National Security Collaboration Center, and that is an entity that was stood up in theory about 7 years ago, in physical presence about 4, And there's a new building coming online this fall that has really been built and funded by the state of Texas, city of San Antonio, UTSA, and private industry to serve DoD problems and to be there for our IC community as well. In San Antonio, we have the largest joint base in the nation. We have NSA Texas, we have Army, Air Force, Navy, R&D, and operational units in the city. And so this has been built not by the Department of Defense, but for the Department of Defense. And the lessons that we learned were mentioned. I think Richard covered some of them. We had to figure out how to build in contracting capabilities, how to recruit faculty and staff that had an interest and expertise in serving the DoD community, how to grow a cleared workforce, not just on the faculty side, but on the staff side, like our contracting offices. So these are things that took us many, many years, and we're still trying to figure out many of the processes to make this a successful ecosystem. But I think the report that was outlaid today really covers a lot of the difficult challenges ahead for those that want to become R1 and want to do that in partnership with the DoD. We have, a pipeline of students, but not enough. So one of the challenges Hispanic serving institutions have is that, there's a dearth in the number of Hispanic PhDs and professorates. And so that alliance that I mentioned briefly is really focused on that. How can we get government investment, industry investment to help drive Hispanic PhD, especially in technology areas? And then how can we also increase the number of professorates in technical areas like engineering and biosciences, but also in education, public health, and other important topics to tackle some of the world's grand challenges. So I'd like to stop there, Michelle. I know that there's Q&A. UTSA is, like I said, learned a lot of the lessons to becoming an R1 and to partnering with the DoD. Over the last 10 years, we've tripled our R&D investment from DoD and IC agencies, and we wouldn't have become an R1 without our partners. We look forward to partnering with the HBCUs as they move forward with this UR effort, and really anyone that would like to hear more on how we taken our journey. Thank you, Michelle.
Okay, well, I want to thank our panelists for their preliminary comments, and seeing that there are so many questions that have been generated by our audience, I want to give enough time to be able to respond to some of those. So I would like to open up and have NDIA pose some questions for our panelists so that we can provide some comment before we go to closing. So Mark, if you wanted to open up the Q&A.
Sure. So we'll have the questions.
Dr. Atkinson, if you could look for your direct message.
Okay. Technology at its best.
Otherwise, I'm happy to read them out if that would be easier for you.
Yeah, if you would go ahead.
Okay, great. So our first question is for Dr. Brothers. How do you envision this ecosystem driving defense and national policy and autonomy? For example, CSAT recommends that UARCs drive collaboration across the services and DoD.
Yeah, thanks for the question, Tim. So I agree with that, because the beauty of UARCs, FRCs, et cetera, is the special trusted relationship, right? And so they can understand the problems, they can deeply, and they can start developing early stage technological solutions. What I see about the ecosystem is the opportunity for collaboration with the UARC of small companies, larger companies, taking that technology and maturing it. And one of the challenges, then if you take that a step further, one of the challenges that small companies can run into is the lack of the ability to scale and the lack of distribution channels, right? So that's where you get into partnering with Lockheed Martin, for example, right? With they do have those kind of challenges, those abilities. And it's something that when I was at DHS we did, where we had still exists, the Silicon Valley Innovation Program, where we funded venture-backed companies to solve real-world problems that the department has, but then we linked them up with larger companies for the distribution channels and the scalability. So that's why I think it's important to have the ecosystem, because as we all know, one of the challenges is this value of death problem. And so it's hard to get research into an actual mature, scalable, commercially viable form. And I think when you have an ecosystem like this that is connected, that does understand the problems, that can apply technologies from a variety of different angles to solve those problems and collaborate, the partnerships that the Academy's talked about, and Dr. Coleman talked about for the UARC, I think it's very important. I think it's a way to solve some of those problems. So hopefully that answers your question.
Michelle, let me jump in with another question, which actually I really like this question. Question is what concrete steps can small businesses, in other words, businesses without necessarily the resources of a large prime, take to engage with the HBCU MSIs, other than cold contacting?
I can take it from my we're kind of medium-sized business. I can take it from our perspective. That's Big Bear AI's perspective. We reached out to we actually kind of cold called Morgan State, quite frankly, and the goal was to develop an internship program with Morgan State. We call it Launchpad. We just set it up last year. We had great interactions with Morgan State. We have had 7 interns, and the goal was to provide a real world work experience, to provide connections and networking opportunities, so that the students have the kinds of partnerships, sponsorships, and mentorships that have been talked about earlier, and selfishly so that we as a company have a workforce that we can call upon going forward. So I don't know how to answer your question, but without cold calling, but I can tell you that talking with Dr. May and others at Morgan State, it has been very effective for us with that internship program that, like I said, we call Launchpad.
This is Michelle. I'd like to also ask JR to contribute to that question about how Lockheed Martin, as a large prime, also supports small businesses that may be minority based.
Certainly, Michelle, thank you. Through our supply chain activities, we certainly have opportunity, as we're thinking about future business, to engage with a range of companies from small to mid-size. We also have a robust venture capital group, the Lockheed Martin Ventures Fund, that works with really entrepreneurial firms that are thinking out of the box in many ways about technology development and R&D, which is yet another pathway for engagement. And then finally, there are always partnership opportunities through our business areas and through our lab network. These organizations include, for example, our Skunk Works division, our Advanced Research Group out of Missiles and Fire Control, our Advanced Technology Center out of Lockheed Martin Space that is now promoting our Space 2050 vision, our Rotary Mission Systems R&D groups, our Sikorsky Innovations Lab, we have Stellar Lab in Australia, and then last but not least, our Advanced Technology Laboratories that I mentioned earlier. And these lab organizations enable researchers to perform really impactful IRAD that they otherwise would not have been able to do long-term, uninterrupted revolutionary research, right? And they sort of serve as our unified face of Lockheed Martin research to the outside government, customers, and broader community to help meet our customers' needs. And then certainly, there's always opportunity by working with us to tap into our network with our academic institutions and partners and other external organizations. So I'll stop there.
Okay, thank you. There has been a question that I really would like Dr. May and Jacqueline to try to address or give their perspectives on that I think is on Slido, and it is that as an institution that identifies as MSI, F22 undergrad enrollment is 36% African American and 16% Hispanic. How do we advocate for access for federal funding set-asides given they are not meeting the criterion that was previously discussed at the 50% threshold. I'd ask our academic panelists to give some thoughts on how they could possibly achieve bridging into opportunity sets.
Dr. Shaw, I will allow you to take the first bite at that apple. And can you repeat the question? I didn't fully grasp it.
Yes, this was from Julie Voorhees from University of North Carolina, not sure what campus, but
Okay.
as an institution that identifies as MSI, F22 undergraduate enrollment is at 36% African American and 16% Hispanic. How do we advocate for access to the federal funding set-asides, given the previously it was discussed at a 50% enrollment threshold for MIs versus MSIs as a distinguishing factor?
I'm assuming she's talking about her particular university.
Yes, in
Okay.
reference, but the question in general is really about the challenge for institutions that don't meet thresholds of 25% for enrollment for a minority serving institution, or the threshold identified as 50% for an MI. So how do these universities that have minority populations but don't meet those minimum thresholds also try to compete for set-aside funding? Any perspectives from an academic strategist standpoint?
Michelle, this is Jacqueline. I had to switch over to my cell phone. I would say that through partnership, there are many institutions in Texas that their HSIs or not, but through partnership, we're able to go together and advocate for funding at the congressional level, also through, federal agency advocacy, and where some of the smaller institutions in particular are not going to be competitive in certain technology areas, certain disciplines, they can partner with an institution that is strong in the area. And, I know here in Texas and in many states, we share students. So our pipeline is built off of the other institutions around us in the region. So I think through partnership is one suggestion I might make to those institutions that are not meeting the HSI, MSI, HBCU threshold.
Okay, thank you. Dr. May?
I'm not sure I can improve on that answer. I see we still have some of our DOD officials on the call. I think that might be a question that probably they might be able to feel better than I could, to be frank with you.
Okay, well, I want to thank our panelists for dialing in today. And I, in closing, would say that one of the factors that I think is very important, having been 30 years in the Air Force and served in both academic and corporate roles, is that many of our researchers need to understand the language and the processes that are involved, the familiarity, and being able to raise the knowledge of how to navigate the processes that are involved helps them educate and better prepare to be competitive, regardless of what institution they're from. So I think part of the dialogue is to create knowledge generation and courses that are focused on how to better engage with DoD, how to talk the language, and how to direct research in terms of mission and role, which I think is very important, whether it's for basic research or advanced. And so with that, I'd like to turn the discussion back over to Mark.
Michelle, actually, thank you so much for this panel. I thought it was a phenomenal discussion. I have the one last role of concluding this event. And again, I'm going to start with a hearty thank you to all of our speakers, our National Academy presentation. I've learned a lot. I've enjoyed the dialogue. I want to emphasize again that this was actually part one of a two-part series. We will have a next event co-sponsored by ETI and our S&T division here at NDIA. It will be a workshop to promote partnerships between HBCU, MSIs, defense, industry, and government. We're look for scheduling information. We're identifying dates as we speak, likely late fall 2022. We plan to have it here in person at NDIA headquarters in scenic Arlington, Virginia. For further information, email eti@ndia.org. Lastly, I want to thank our team here at ETI and NDIA. A special thanks to Dr. Anna Melker, who helped put this all together. Camilla Shanley, who was instrumental. My colleague, Dr. Rune Serafin, our deputy director here, has also been instrumental. And let me thank our audience for your participation. And we look forward to engaging with you in part 2 in late fall of 2022. And with that, let me wish you all a good rest of the day. And thank you for joining us.
Thank you for hosting it.